Sometimes the greatest lesson in humility comes from where we least expect it. At a Chicago high school, a boy who had it all, money, power, influence, discovered he was losing the only thing that truly mattered, his humanity. Lucas Morrison, son of one of the city's wealthiest businessmen, thought he could buy respect through fear. But when his father, Carlos Morrison, discovered what his son was doing with a classmate named Miguel, everything changed. This isn't just a story about bullying. It's about how a courageous father turned shame into redemption, how a moment of justice can change entire lives, and how sometimes we need to lose everything to find who we truly are. Because in the end, it doesn't matter how many zeros you have in your bank account. If you have no character, you have nothing. What happened at that Chicago school proves that true wealth isn't in what you own, but in what you do with the power you have. And when Carlos Morrison decided to show up at his son's school, he had no idea he was about to teach the most important lesson of their lives, to Lucas, to Miguel, and to everyone who witnessed that transformative moment. Lucas Morrison stepped out of his armored black BMW as if he owned the world. At 16, he had already learned that money bought everything: respect, friendship, even silence when necessary. Lincoln High School, a public school in downtown Chicago, had never seen anyone like him. As other students arrived by bus or on foot, Lucas adjusted the Rolex watch on his wrist and surveyed the building with disdain. "What a pathetic place," he muttered, completely ignoring the driver holding the door open. The school hallway fell silent as he passed. Lucas wore sneakers that cost more than most of the parents' monthly salaries, and he made sure everyone knew it. He wasn't there by choice. His father had decided he needed to see the real world before taking over the family business. But Lucas had other plans. If he was going to be stuck in this place for a year, he might as well have some fun. His eyes scanned the faces around him, searching for signs of weakness, of vulnerability. The school secretary treated him like royalty, obviously instructed by the principal about who the new student was. Lucas smiled arrogantly as he signed the papers. He knew a simple call from his father could change any rule at that school. The other students whispered among themselves, some impressed, others clearly uncomfortable with his presence. He enjoyed this feeling of power, of being feared before he even opened his mouth. When the bell rang for first class, Lucas walked the halls like a predator choosing its first prey. The Lincoln High cafeteria was like a perfect social map. Each table represented a different tribe. Lucas observed everything from his table in the center, strategically positioned for a full view. The jocks occupied the right corner, the cheerleaders sat near the windows, and the nerds hid in the back. But what caught his attention most were the loners, the ones eating in silence, avoiding eye contact. These were the perfect targets. He bit into his gourmet sandwich brought from home, studying every face, every gesture, every sign of insecurity. Lucas had learned from a young age to spot weaknesses, a skill his father used in business and one he had absorbed naturally. A shy girl with thick glasses ate alone near the trash can. A skinny boy leafed through a book while munching on a simple peanut butter sandwich. Another boy, of Latino descent, sat in the far corner, as if trying to become invisible. Perfect, Lucas thought, a cruel smile forming on his lips. He didn't need friends, he needed subjects. At the elite private school he'd attended before, everyone already respected him because of the Morrison surname. Here, he would have to build his reputation from scratch, and he knew exactly how to do it. Fear was a universal language, and Lucas spoke it fluently, his eyes fixed especially on the Latino boy in the corner. There was something about him that awakened his predatory instinct. Power wasn't just about having money. It was about knowing how to use it as a weapon. Lucas finished his lunch observing the patterns of behavior around him. Who talked to who avoided whom, which table held the most influence. In less than an hour, he had mapped out the entire social hierarchy of the school. Now it was just a matter of choosing where to begin his climb to the top and deciding who would be trampled along the way. Miguel Hernandez tried to make himself invisible in the corner of the cafeteria, but his efforts were in vain. Lucas had been watching him for 3 consecutive days, always alone, always quiet, always wearing the same clean but clearly worn clothes. The 15-year-old boy possessed something that deeply irritated Lucas, a silent dignity that bowed to no one. While other students had already begun to greet him with forced reverence, Miguel simply ignored him, as if Lucas were just another student. This was unacceptable. Lucas was used to being the center of attention, to having people vying for his approval. Miguel read during lunch, studied during breaks, and and walked the halls with his head held high, despite his simple clothes and patched backpack. There was an inner strength about him that Lucas couldn't understand. How could someone with so little seem so complete? This tranquility bothered him more than any direct challenge. On Wednesday, Lucas made his decision. Miguel would be his first project at Lincoln High, the example that would establish his position in the school hierarchy. He observed the boy's habits. He always arrived early, always ate lunch in the same place, always grabbed the same books from his locker. Lucas smiled. Predictability was vulnerability. He could already imagine how easy it would be to shatter that facade of serenity, how satisfying it would be to see Miguel bow before his power. During history class, Lucas continued studying his target. Miguel answered the teacher's questions intelligently but without arrogance. He helped classmates in need without expecting anything in return. He was respected, but not popular. The perfect combination for someone Lucas wanted to destroy. Because in Lucas Morrison's world, there was no room for two kinds of respect. You either feared him or you would be taught to fear him. The perfect opportunity arose on Friday between math and science classes. Miguel was walking down the main hallway carrying a stack of books. Some borrowed from the library, others clearly used, purchased from secondhand bookstores. Lucas waited for the exact moment when the hallway was full of students, ensuring an audience for his first act of domination. With a calculated move, he accidentally bumped into Miguel, sending all the books flying across the floor in an explosion of pages and loose covers. "Whoa, sorry," Lucas said with a fake smile, loud enough for everyone to hear. But his eyes said something completely different. They were cold, calculating, filled with a cruelty that made the other students instinctively recoil. Miguel immediately bent down to gather his books, and Lucas took the opportunity to accidentally step on one of the notebooks, leaving a clearly visible mark on the cover. The sound of Lucas's laughter echoed through the hallway, followed by the nervous chuckles of a few students who wanted to be on the right side of the situation. Miguel looked up for a second, meeting Lucas's gaze. There was no anger there, no fear, just a deep sadness that momentarily made Lucas feel uncomfortable. But the feeling quickly passed as Miguel simply continued gathering his belongings in silence, without retaliation, without complaint. This passive reaction angered Lucas even more. He wanted an answer, wanted to see Miguel break down, beg, show some sign of acknowledging his superiority. The dignified silence was almost an affront. "Watch your step, man," Lucas added, lightly kicking one of the books away as Miguel tried to reach it. Some students laughed, others looked away, clearly uncomfortable, but lacking the courage to intervene. Miguel finally gathered himself together, slowly stood up, and continued on his way without a word. Lucas stood still, watching him walk away, a mixture of satisfaction and frustration growing in his chest. The first battle was won, but the war was just beginning. The following Monday, Lucas decided to escalate his intimidation campaign. He had noticed that Miguel always bought the school lunch, a simple tray with what he could afford with the coins he carefully counted before reaching the cashier. It was obvious that every penny mattered to him, which made the situation all the more delightful for Lucas. He waited for Miguel in the cafeteria line, strategically positioning himself behind him with two of his new friends, boys who had quickly realized the advantages of being with the son of the richest businessman in town. "Hey, Miguel," Lucas said, placing a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'm a little short on cash today, man. You don't mind lending me some change, do you?" The question sounded casual, but the squeeze on Miguel's shoulder made it clear it wasn't really a question. The other students in line began to pay attention, some whispering among themselves, others pretending not to see anything. Miguel turned slowly, his eyes meeting Lucas's with a calmness that deeply irritated the rich kid. "I only have enough for lunch," Miguel replied quietly, his voice firm despite the situation. Lucas laughed loudly, a sound that wasn't at all amusing. "Oh, that's a shame, but I'm sure you can go without today, right? After all, you seem used to it." The words cut through the air like blades, and Miguel felt his face heat with humiliation. Some students laughed nervously, others lowered their eyes, embarrassed to witness this but lacking the courage to intervene. Miguel hesitated for a moment, his hands trembling slightly as he held the coins. Lucas could see the internal struggle going on, dignity battling against the need to avoid further trouble. Finally, shoulders hunched in defeat, Miguel reached out and handed over his lunch money. Lucas took the coins with a triumphant smile, pretending to count them as if they were a large sum. "Thanks, man. You're quite a friend." He walked away laughing with his cronies, leaving Miguel standing in line, broken without lunch, while the other students avoided his embarrassed gaze. The two-bedroom apartment on Chicago's South Side was small but always spotless. Miguel arrived home at 4 in the afternoon, as he did every day, to find his mother, Carmen, finishing folding clothes at the living room table. She worked as a cleaner in 3 different offices and sewed at night to supplement her rent, but she always found time to ask about her son's day. "How was school today, mijo?" she asked in Spanish, immediately noticing something different about his face. "It was normal, Mom," Miguel lied, forcing a smile as he dropped his backpack on the couch. He couldn't tell her about Lucas, about the humiliation in the cafeteria, about how he'd spent the entire lunchtime hungry while other students whispered and pointed. Carmen had sacrificed too much so he could attend Lincoln High. She worked 16 hours a day, saved every penny, dreamed of the day Miguel would graduate and have a better life. He wasn't going to destroy those dreams with his problems. The dining table doubled as Miguel's study table, and he sat there doing his homework while his mother prepared dinner. The smell of beans and rice filled the small apartment, an aroma that always made him feel at home, safe. Carmen hummed softly as she cooked, occasionally glancing at her son with pride shining in her tired eyes. "You'll be someone important one day," she always said. "Your education is the only inheritance I can give you." After dinner, Miguel helped his mother wash the dishes as she told him about her day. The elderly lady who always left her an extra piece of candy, the boss who had finally praised his work, her plans to save up for a new book for Miguel. Every word she spoke was filled with hope and determination, and Miguel felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He couldn't disappoint her, couldn't let her know that at school he was seen as weak, an easy target. As she smiled, talking about his bright future, Miguel swallowed his pain and silently promised he would be strong enough to protect her dreams. The Lincoln High Science Fair was the most important event of the semester, and Miguel had spent 3 weeks working on his solar energy project. He built a small model house with solar panels made from recycled materials, each piece carefully assembled during the evenings his mother sewed beside him at the kitchen table. The project wasn't just a school assignment for him. It was a chance to show that intelligence and creativity didn't depend on money, that he could compete with anyone using only dedication and effort. Lucas watched Miguel prepare his presentation the morning of the fair, noticing the care with which he fine-tuned every detail of the project. The boy's genuine passion for what he had created deeply irritated Lucas. How could anyone care so much about something so simple? He waited for the perfect moment, when Miguel left the room to get an extension from the office. In less than 2 minutes, Lucas approached the table, pretending to admire the work while checking to see if anyone was watching. With a quick, calculated move, Lucas accidentally spilled a glass of water over the project's circuits. The water spread quickly, damaging the homemade wires and causing a short circuit that caused some parts to smoke. He then discreetly pushed one of the cardboard structures, causing it to partially collapse. When Miguel returned and saw his destroyed project, the despair in his eyes was exactly what Lucas expected to see. "Wow, man, that's bad luck," Lucas said with false sympathy, approaching with some colleagues. "Looks like someone bumped into your desk." Miguel stood there for a long moment, staring at weeks of work ruined in a matter of minutes. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to salvage what he could, but it was obvious there wouldn't be time to fix everything before the presentations began. A few students approached, offering to help, but Lucas quickly distracted them with comments about how these things happen, and how Miguel should have been more careful. As Miguel desperately tried to repair his project, Lucas walked away with a satisfied smile, savoring another victory in his campaign of psychological domination. Mrs. Patterson had been a teacher at Lincoln High for 15 years and knew bullying when she saw it. She watched Lucas shove Miguel in the hallway, heard the cruel comments disguised as jokes, and noticed how other students avoided associating with Miguel for fear of becoming the next target. But when she considered intervening, she remembered the meeting the principal had held with all the teachers about treating the Morrison family with due respect and consideration. The $2 million donation Carlos Morrison had promised for the school's renovation weighed more heavily on her conscience. During literature class, Mrs. Patterson saw Lucas making sarcastic comments about Miguel's presentation, whispers loud enough to be humiliating but quiet enough to seem accidental. Miguel kept his head down, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but he continued to try to participate in the discussion about To Kill a Mockingbird, the irony of the situation not lost on the teacher. She opened her mouth to reprimand Lucas, but then remembered what had happened to Mr. Rodriguez the year before. Fired a week after giving detention to a wealthy student whose parents complained to the administration. "Lucas, would you like to share your thoughts on the topic of justice in the book?" she asked, trying to subtly redirect him. Lucas smiled arrogantly and gave a superficial but technically correct answer, clearly prepared by some private tutor. Mrs. Patterson nodded stiffly, avoiding looking at Miguel, who had raised his hand with a much deeper and more thoughtful answer. She knew she was being cowardly, that she was failing one of her most dedicated students, but she also knew she had 2 daughters to support and couldn't afford to lose her job. At the end of class, when Miguel approached her desk to hand in an extra essay he had voluntarily written, Mrs. Patterson felt a lump in her throat. "Great job, Miguel," she whispered, trying to convey with her eyes all the support she couldn't express publicly. Miguel nodded with a sad smile, as if he fully understood the impossible position she found herself in. As he left the room, Mrs. Patterson closed her eyes and tried to convince herself that she was protecting everyone else by not confronting Lucas. But deep down, she knew she was only protecting herself. The second-floor bathroom was the only place in the school where Miguel felt safe to let his guard down. He locked himself in one of the stalls and finally allowed the tears he'd been holding back all day to fall freely. 3 weeks of constant humiliation, starvation during lunch, sabotaged projects, and cruel laughter had taken their toll. His hands shook as he tried to compose himself, knowing that in a few minutes he would have to walk out and pretend everything was okay, that Lucas's words didn't affect him, that he was strong enough to handle all of this alone. The worst part wasn't even Lucas's cruelty. It was the loneliness that followed. Miguel had always been quiet, but he had never felt so isolated. The few friends he had at school now avoided him, afraid of associating with Lucas Morrison's target. He understood their logic, didn't blame them, but that didn't make the pain any less intense. During class, he felt like a ghost, present but invisible, existing only when Lucas decided to make him the center of some new public humiliation. Miguel considered telling his mother everything, imagining how relieving it would be to share this burden with someone. But then he remembered her tired face when she came home after working 3 shifts, the sacrifices she made every day so he could have a better education. How could he add another worry to her already difficult life? How could he admit he was failing at the one thing she'd asked of him, that he study and stay out of trouble? The guilt of not being strong enough weighed as heavily as the pain of humiliation. He wiped his eyes with toilet paper and took a deep breath, preparing himself for another day of survival. Miguel stared at his reflection in the foggy bathroom mirror and tried to find some semblance of the confidence he used to have. "Just a few more months," he whispered to himself. "I just have to hold out until the end of the school year." But deep down, a part of him was beginning to doubt whether he could hold out that long. With each passing day, Lucas seemed more creative in his cruelties, and Miguel felt his defenses slowly crumbling, like a sandcastle being washed away by the waves. The final humiliation came during recess on Thursday, when Miguel was alone in the library, trying to study for a chemistry test. Lucas entered with his followers, pretending to look for a book, but his eyes were fixed on Miguel from the moment he walked through the door. He silently approached from behind, turned on his cell phone camera, and began recording while whispering cruel comments about Miguel's thrift store clothes, his homeless backpack, and how he smelled of poverty. Miguel only realized what was happening when he heard the muffled laughter of the other boys. "Guys, look at our little classmate here," Lucas said to the camera, holding the phone close to Miguel's blushing face. "Studying hard to get a scholarship, right? Because it's the only way someone like you can achieve anything in life." Miguel tried to get up and leave, but Lucas blocked his path, continuing to record, while commenting on how Miguel probably scavenged food from the trash, and how his family must live under a bridge. The librarian was busy with other students and didn't notice what was happening in the back of the room. The video lasted only 2 minutes, but to Miguel it felt like an eternity. Lucas captured every moment of his humiliation, the trembling in his hands, the tears he desperately tried to hold back, the way his voice cracked as he tried to tell them to stop. "This is going to look great on Instagram," Lucas laughed, already editing the video right then and there. "I'm going to tag the whole school so no one misses this masterpiece." Miguel finally managed to get past them and ran out of the library, leaving his books behind as Lucas's laughter echoed through the halls. Within an hour, the video was online with the caption, "When you don't even have money to buy dignity. Poor kid. You're Lincoln High. Pathetic." The likes and cruel comments started pouring in immediately. each notification like a stab in Miguel's heart. Students he didn't even know started laughing as he passed through the halls, some even mimicking his expressions from the video. Lucas had achieved what he wanted, to turn Miguel into a joke for the entire school, an example of what happened to those who didn't bow to his power. That night, Miguel came home and lied to his mother once again, saying everything was fine, while inside, he felt as if a part of his soul had died. Carlos Morrison arrived at Chicago's O'Hare Airport at 10 o'clock on Thursday night, after 2 weeks of closing deals in Europe. At 45, he had built a business empire from scratch, working 18 hours a day since he was 20, to give his son everything he himself never had. His driver was waiting for him with the car, and on the drive home, Carlos thought only of resting and spending the weekend with Lucas, perhaps taking him golfing or watching a Bulls game. He had missed many important moments in his son's life because of his business, and he always tried to make up for it with expensive gifts and exclusive experiences. The Lincoln Park mansion was quiet when he arrived. Lucas was already asleep, and Carlos climbed the Italian marble stairs, thinking about how the boy had grown during his absence. He left his bags in the master bedroom and went to the office to check some urgent emails before bed. The routine was always the same: work, travel, more work. Carlos had convinced himself he was doing all this for his son, building a legacy that Lucas would one day inherit. But deep down, a small voice questioned whether he was missing something important in the process. On Friday morning, Carlos woke up early, as he always did, even after long trips. He made coffee and waited for Lucas to come down for breakfast, eager to hear about the last few weeks at his new school. "How's Lincoln High going?" he asked when his son appeared in the kitchen, still sleepy. Lucas shrugged and mumbled something about adjusting well as he scrolled through his phone. Carlos noticed the lack of enthusiasm, but chalked it up to typical teenage attitude. He'd been that way himself when his son was younger. "Are you making friends? Are the teachers good?" Carlos persisted, genuinely interested in how Lucas was faring in the real world he so desperately wanted his son to experience. Lucas responded in monosyllables, clearly more interested in what he was seeing on his phone screen than in the conversation with his father. Carlos felt a pang of frustration. He had spent weeks away, working to secure his family's future, and all he received in return was indifference. But he decided not to press. Perhaps Lucas just needed time to open up about his experiences at his new school. The phone rang in Carlos's office at 2 p.m. on Friday, interrupting an important video conference with Japanese investors. He normally didn't answer calls during meetings, but the name Lincoln High School on the display prompted him to apologize to his partners and answer immediately. On the other end, Principal Margaret Foster's nervous voice sounded hesitant, as if she were choosing each word carefully. "Mr. Morrison, thank you for answering. I need to talk to you about Lucas. Would it be possible to schedule a meeting for Monday?" Carlos felt his stomach tighten. In 16 years, he had never received a call from the school about his son's behavioral problems. "What happened?" he asked directly, dispensing with formalities. The principal hesitated again before answering. "Well, we've received some complaints about Lucas's behavior with other students. Nothing too serious yet, but we thought it best to talk to you before the situation worsens." The way she spoke, avoiding specific details, made Carlos even more worried. What kind of complaints? Carlos persisted, mentally canceling all appointments for the rest of the afternoon. Principal Foster sighed on the other end of the line. "Lucas has been involved in some incidents with a classmate. Bullying, inappropriate comments, behavior that doesn't align with our school's values." Each word was like a punch to Carlos's gut. He had sent Lucas to a public school precisely so he would learn humility, so he would understand how ordinary people lived. How had this turned into bullying? "I'll be right there," Carlos said, already rising from his executive chair. No need," the director replied quickly. "We can sort this out on Monday. We don't want to create an unnecessary fuss." But Carlos had already hung up the phone and was grabbing his car keys. 20 years of building an impeccable reputation in business, respected for his integrity and values, and now he discovered he had raised a son who bullied less fortunate colleagues. The irony was too bitter to ignore. He had failed at the only thing that truly mattered. Carlos drove to Lincoln High in silence, his mind racing with 1,000 possibilities about what Lucas might have done. He parked in front of the school and sat in the car for a few minutes, watching the students file out of the building. They were normal kids from working-class families, exactly the kind of environment he wanted Lucas to experience. How could his son have interpreted this experience as an opportunity to bully the underprivileged? Carlos took a deep breath and walked into the school, determined to uncover the whole truth before confronting Lucas. The conversation with Principal Foster was even worse than he'd imagined. She showed him teacher reports of cruel comments, student testimonies of systematic bullying, and finally, with obvious reluctance, mentioned a video that was circulating on social media. "I'd really prefer if you talked to Lucas first," she said, clearly uncomfortable. But Carlos insisted on seeing the whole thing. When she showed him the video on the school computer, Carlos felt like he'd been punched in the gut. There was his son, laughing cruelly as he humiliated a boy who clearly had no way of defending himself. Carlos saw the pain in the boy's eyes, heard Lucas's venomous comments about poverty and dignity, and felt such deep shame he had trouble breathing. "Who is this boy?" he asked, pointing to Miguel on the screen. "Miguel Hernandez," the principal replied. "An excellent student, highly respected by his teachers. He comes from a humble but hardworking family. His mother works as a cleaning lady to support them both alone." Carlos closed his eyes and saw himself at 15, poor, working after school to help his family, dreaming of a better future. He had built his fortune precisely so no child would have to endure the hardships he had. And now he discovered that his own son was torturing exactly the kind of boy he had been. "I need a copy of that video," he said hoarsely. "And I want the Hernandez family's address. I have some amends to make." Carlos arrived home at 6 o'clock, finding Lucas playing video games in the living room as if nothing had happened. The boy didn't even look up from the screen when his father entered, only mumbling an absent-minded, "Hi, Dad," as he continued shooting virtual enemies. Carlos stood there for a moment, observing the son he had raised, 16 years old, all money could buy, and seemingly devoid of empathy or responsibility. He turned off the television with the remote, causing Lucas to finally look at him in irritation. "Seriously, Dad? I was in the middle of an online game," Lucas complained, throwing the controller onto the Italian leather sofa. Carlos sat in the armchair across from his son, his hands shaking slightly with pent-up anger. "We need to talk about school," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Lucas sighed dramatically. "Oh, the principal called? Look, it was nothing serious. Just a misunderstanding with some students. You know how it is, Dad. Poor people always get into trouble when they see someone with money." Lucas's casual response was like pouring gasoline on a fire. Carlos pulled out his phone and opened the video the principal had sent, turning the screen to his son. "Explain this to me," he said, pressing play. Lucas watched for a few seconds and shrugged. "Oh, that's it. It was just a joke, Dad. The boy is very sensitive. I was just messing with him a little." The complete lack of remorse in his son's voice made Carlos feel as if he didn't know the person sitting across from him. "A joke?" Carlos repeated, his voice rising for the first time. "You call this a joke? Humiliating a kid who can't defend himself? Posting a video for the whole school to laugh at?" Lucas rolled his eyes. "Relax, Dad. That's how it works at school. There are strong and weak. I'm just showing you my place in the hierarchy." Carlos was silent for a long moment, processing the fact that he had utterly failed as a father. The boy sitting across from him held none of the values he'd tried to instill. Or maybe he'd never really taught anything other than that money solved everything. That same night, Carlos locked himself in his office and did something he hadn't done in years. He used his resources to investigate someone for personal, not professional reasons. Within 2 hours, he had a complete report on the Hernandez family. Carmen Hernandez, 38, had been a widow for 3 years after her husband died in a construction accident. She worked as a cleaning lady in 3 different places, earning little more than minimum wage, but always paid all bills on time. Miguel, 15, had excellent grades, had never been in trouble, and participated in volunteer tutoring programs for younger students. The details of their lives moved him deeply. Carmen had refused to accept government assistance, preferring to work 3 shifts to maintain the family's dignity. Miguel had won a partial scholarship to Lincoln High based purely on academic merit. His grades were better than Lucas's, despite all the hardships he faced. They lived in a small but clean apartment on the south side, paid their rent on time, and Carmen still found time to volunteer at the local church on Sundays. Carlos looked at the photos from the investigation, Miguel helping his mother carry shopping bags, the 2 of them walking to church together, Carmen sewing at night at the kitchen table while her son studied beside her. This was a family he would respect under any circumstances. people who worked hard and maintained their dignity despite hardships. And his son had chosen these very people to torture, as if poverty were a character flaw rather than a life circumstance. The most painful part of the report was the section on Miguel's academic record. Teachers described him as exceptionally mature, always willing to help, a role model for other students. There were mentions of how he mediated conflicts between classmates, how he offered math help to those struggling, how he never missed class even when he was clearly ill. Carlos closed his laptop and rested his head in his hands, realizing that Miguel Hernandez, at 15, was already more of a man than Lucas had ever been. Carlos couldn't sleep that night. He stayed awake until 3 in the morning, pacing the silent house, past bedrooms filled with expensive toys Lucas had abandoned, past shelves filled with sports trophies that money had bought through private coaches and state-of-the-art equipment. Every object in the house told the story of a father who had confused material provision with moral education. He stopped in front of the family portrait in the living room. Him, Lucas, and his ex-wife on vacation in France, all smiling for the camera. But there was something hollow in those smiles he had never noticed before. He remembered his own childhood in Detroit, the son of a factory worker and a seamstress. His parents never had money, but they had strict principles about respect, hard work, and treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their social status. Money comes and goes, his mother always said, but character is forever. Carlos had promised himself he would give his son everything he didn't have, but in the process, he had forgotten to give Lucas the only thing that truly mattered: strong values and empathy for others. The painful truth was that he had created a monster, not intentionally, but through years of emotional neglect disguised as financial generosity. Every time Lucas did something questionable, Carlos would settle it with money, paying to hush up problems, buying gifts to compensate for absences, using his influence to shield his son from the consequences of his actions. He had taught Lucas that wealth was power, and power meant you could do whatever you wanted to those weaker than you. At 4 in the morning, Carlos sat in his leather armchair and made the most difficult decision of his life as a father. He would no longer shield Lucas from the consequences of his actions. He would no longer use money to solve problems that required lessons in character. And most importantly, he would personally go to school on Monday to ensure his son learned the meaning of responsibility, humility, and redemption. If he had failed as a father so far, he would at least try to correct his course before it was too late. On Sunday morning, Carlos woke up with a mental clarity he hadn't felt in years. He had spent the entire Saturday researching bullying, its psychological consequences, and the best ways to deal with it. He read scientific articles, spoke with psychologists over the phone, and even watched documentaries about the impact of school bullying on young people's lives. Each piece of information he absorbed further convinced him that the situation required drastic and immediate intervention. Lucas wasn't going to learn through conversations or domestic punishments. He needed to face the consequences of his actions publicly, just as he had publicly humiliated Miguel. Carlos canceled all his Monday appointments and called his personal assistant, instructing him to reschedule 3 important meetings and a video conference with European investors. Something more urgent came up, he explained without elaborating. For the first time in his 20-year career, Carlos was putting fatherhood above business. He knew this decision could cost millions in lost contracts, but he also knew that no amount of money would be worth more than his son's soul. He spent Sunday afternoon planning every detail of what he would do at school. It wouldn't just be a private conversation with the principal or a discreet reprimand. Carlos had decided that Lucas needed to publicly apologize to Miguel in front of the entire school and take full responsibility for his actions. More than that, he was going to announce that Lucas would do community service for the next 6 months, helping needy families in the community. If the boy wanted to act superior to the poor, he was going to learn the value of hard work and humility firsthand. That night during dinner, Carlos watched Lucas eat absent-mindedly while fiddling with his phone, completely oblivious to what was to come. "Tomorrow you're going to school with me," Carlos announced calmly. Lucas looked up, surprised. "Why? I can go alone, like always." Carlos cut a piece of meat and replied without looking at his son, "Because we have some things to take care of there." "And Lucas?" The boy looked at him curiously. "Put on your best clothes. It's going to be a day you'll never forget." Miguel woke up on Monday with the same knot in his stomach that had been with him every morning for weeks. The weekend had been a temporary relief, but now he would face 5 more days of humiliation at Lincoln High. He dressed slowly, choosing his most modest clothes in hopes of not attracting attention, knowing Lucas would always find something to criticize. The video was still online, still receiving cruel comments, and Miguel knew more students would have seen it over the weekend. The shame seemed to grow with each passing day, like a wound that wouldn't heal. During breakfast, Carmen noticed her son was quieter than usual. "Are you okay, mijo?" she asked, serving scrambled eggs to his plate. Miguel forced a smile and nodded, but he could barely eat. How could he explain to his mother that he'd become the laughingstock of the school? How could he tell her that other students avoided him as if poverty were contagious? Carmen worked so hard to give him better opportunities, and he felt like he was wasting all her sacrifices by failing to stand up for himself. On the way to school, Miguel considered faking sick and heading home, but he knew he couldn't keep running forever. Besides, he had a history test in third period, and his grades were the only thing he was still proud of. He took a deep breath and kept walking, mentally preparing himself for another day of survival. Maybe Lucas would be in a better mood and leave him alone. Maybe the video would finally stop getting attention. Maybe things would get better on their own. When he arrived at school, Miguel saw some students whispering and pointing in his direction. His heart sank. The video had clearly gained even more views over the weekend. He lowered his head and walked quickly to his locker, trying to become invisible. But deep down, he knew there was no escape. Lucas had made his life a living hell, and there seemed to be nothing he could do to change that. All he could do was endure and hope that one day, somehow, this nightmare would come to an end. Lucas woke up on Monday feeling particularly pleased with himself. Miguel's video had racked up over 500 views over the weekend, and the comments kept coming, each one more cruel than the last. He checked social media while still in bed, smiling at how other students were sharing it and adding their own jokes about the poor kid from Lincoln High. Lucas had achieved exactly what he wanted, to establish his position as the school's alpha and make Miguel an example of what happened to those who didn't respect him. In the shower, he hummed a pop song while using hair products that cost more than Miguel's mother's weekly salary. Lucas carefully chose his outfit, a designer polo shirt, designer jeans, and limited edition sneakers that had cost $1,200. Each item was a statement of superiority, a way to remind everyone at school of the difference between him and losers like Miguel. He looked in the mirror and smiled with satisfaction. He was in complete control. At breakfast, Lucas barely paid attention when his father said he'd drive him to school. He was busy responding to messages from other students who wanted to partner with him after the video's viral success. "Whatever," he muttered when Carlos repeated that they should leave early. Lucas assumed his father wanted to take the opportunity to get to know the school better, perhaps even make a larger donation to ensure the teachers continued to treat him with special deference. The idea appealed to him, another public demonstration of his power and influence. During the car ride, Lucas mentally planned his next pranks on Miguel. Maybe it was time to escalate even further, involve other students, create a systematic campaign of humiliation that would last the rest of the school year. He looked out the BMW window and saw some classmates walking to school, carrying old backpacks and wearing simple clothes. Poor things, he thought dismissively. At least they know their place in the hierarchy. Lucas had no idea that in a few hours, he would be the one to learn about hierarchy, humility, and the true consequences of his actions. The silence in the BMW was tense as Carlos drove through the streets of Chicago toward Lincoln High. Lucas was distracted by his phone, responding to messages and checking how many likes Miguel's video had received overnight. Completely oblivious to the storm about to descend upon him, Carlos watched his son in the rearview mirror, seeing the expression of cruel satisfaction on the boy's face, and felt a mixture of anger and sadness that made him want to stop the car and shake Lucas until he understood the gravity of the situation. "Lucas," Carlos finally said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "I want you to tell me exactly what happened to this boy, Miguel Hernandez." Lucas looked up from his phone, surprised by his father's serious tone. "Oh, that. I told you, Dad, it was just a joke. The boy is very dramatic. He can't take an innocent joke." The casual way Lucas dismissed someone else's pain made Carlos grip the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Innocent play?" Carlos repeated, stopping at a red light and turning to look his son directly in the eye. "You think publicly humiliating someone, stealing their lunch money, and posting a video for the whole school to laugh at is innocent play?" Lucas frowned, irritated by the interrogation. "Relax, Dad. That's how it works at school. There's always been the popular kids and the nerds. I'm just showing where everyone fits in. Besides, it's not like I physically hurt him or anything." Carlos took a deep breath, trying to control the anger building in his chest. "Lucas, in a few hours you'll learn what responsibility means. You'll apologize to this kid in front of the entire school. You'll take full responsibility for your actions. And you'll start doing community service to understand the value of the people you've been scorning." Lucas laughed, thinking his father was bluffing. "Oh, come on, Dad. You're not going to embarrass me in front of the entire school because of some random kid." Carlos looked at his son with an expression Lucas had never seen before. Cold, determined, unyielding. "Watch and learn," was all he said before speeding off toward school. Carlos Morrison's black BMW pulled up in front of Lincoln High School at 7:45 in the morning, 15 minutes before the first bell. Early arriving students stopped to stare at the luxury car, whispering among themselves about who it might be. When Carlos got out of the driver's side, wearing a $3,000 suit and a serious expression reminiscent of a general preparing for battle, some students recognized him immediately. They'd seen his picture in the local papers as one of Chicago's most influential businessmen. Lucas got out on the other side, still confident, waving to a few classmates as if it were a normal social visit. Carlos's entrance into the building caused an immediate commotion. Secretaries stopped typing, teachers came out of their offices to see what was happening, and students crowded the hallways trying to understand why the school's richest father had shown up in person. Carlos walked straight to the main office, his footsteps echoing down the linoleum hallway like drumbeats. "I need to speak with Principal Foster immediately," he told the secretary, who nearly spilled her coffee in her excitement. "And I want all students gathered in the auditorium within 30 minutes. Lucas finally began to realize something was wrong. The expression on his father's face wasn't one of pride or satisfaction. It was one of cold, unyielding determination. "Dad, what are you doing?" he whispered, but Carlos ignored him completely, focused on his mission. Principal Foster appeared quickly, clearly surprised and a little intimidated by the unexpected presence of the school's most generous donor. "Mr. Morrison, we weren't expecting you today. Can we talk in my office?" Carlos shook his head. "No, this will be public. My son has something important to say to the entire school." Within minutes, the news spread through the halls like wildfire. "Lucas's dad is here and wants to talk to everyone in the auditorium. Has Lucas gotten into trouble? Man, I've never seen anyone's dad show up at school like that." Miguel, who was at his locker gathering books for his first period, heard the whispers and felt his stomach churn. Anything involving Lucas Morrison couldn't be good for him. He slowly closed his locker, bracing himself for yet another public humiliation, never imagining that his life was about to change completely. Principal Foster closed her office door and offered Carlos coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to maintain her professional composure. Lucas slumped into one of the leather chairs, still thinking this was an unnecessary overreaction from his father, while Carlos remained standing, his presence completely dominating the small space. "Mr. Morrison," the principal began cautiously, "perhaps we can resolve this situation more discreetly. We don't need to involve the entire school." Carlos interrupted her with a firm wave of his hand. "Principal Foster, my son publicly humiliated a classmate. The reparation needs to be public too." "Dad, you're overreacting," Lucas protested, finally realizing the situation was getting out of hand. "It was just a silly joke. Everyone's already forgotten." Carlos turned to his son with an expression that made Lucas shrink in his chair. "Everyone's forgotten? Then explain to me why the video is still online. Getting cruel comments? Explain to me why Miguel Hernandez probably couldn't sleep all weekend." Carlos's voice was low but charged with an authority that made even the principal sit up straight. Principal Foster tried once again to mediate the situation. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your concern, but a general assembly may create more drama than it solves. Perhaps a private, supervised conversation among the boys would be more appropriate." Carlos shook his head decisively. "Principal, with all due respect, you've had weeks to resolve this privately and done nothing. Now I'm going to resolve it my way. I want all students in the auditorium in 15 minutes, and I want Miguel Hernandez brought here first." Lucas finally understood that his father was serious. "You can't make me do this," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "I'm not going to humiliate myself in front of the entire school because of some random kid." Carlos approached his son's chair, leaning down until they were face to face. "Lucas, you have two options. Either you do this the right way, taking responsibility for your actions, or I tell the whole school exactly what kind of person you are, Show them the video you made and let them draw their own conclusions. The choice is yours." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Principal Foster calling the main office, asking for Miguel Hernandez to be summoned to the main office. The Lincoln High auditorium had never seen such activity. Within 15 minutes, all 600 students were seated in the blue plastic chairs, whispering speculations about what was happening. Some were certain Lucas had gotten himself into serious trouble. Others thought Carlos Morrison was there to make a major announcement about donations to the school. At the back of the auditorium, Miguel sat alone as usual, trying to make himself invisible while feeling the curious gazes occasionally turn his way. Some students had already connected his presence in the principal's office with the unexpected assembly. The teachers lined the sides of the auditorium, equally curious and apprehensive. Mrs. Patterson, who had spent weeks feeling guilty for not intervening in the bullying, watched the situation with a mixture of hope and nervousness. She had seen Carlos Morrison on the news, a man known for his business integrity and philanthropy, but also for his unyielding determination when it came to doing what he believed was right. If he was there, it meant someone was finally going to do something about Lucas's behavior. The hubbub ceased completely when Carlos entered the auditorium, followed by Lucas, who walked like a condemned man being led to the scaffold. The difference between father and son was stark. Carlos radiated authority and purpose, while Lucas seemed to have shrunk, his usual arrogance replaced by palpable anxiety. Carlos walked firmly onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the audience of young faces, many of whom watched him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Lucas stood to the side, his hands trembling slightly as he avoided looking directly at the audience. "Good morning, students of Lincoln High," Carlos began, his voice echoing clearly through the quiet auditorium. "My name is Carlos Morrison, and I am Lucas Morrison's father. I am here today because my son did something that goes against everything I believe in and everything I tried to teach him." A murmur ran through the audience. No one expected a wealthy father to come to school to publicly criticize his own son. Miguel, at the back of the auditorium, felt his heart race, unsure whether to feel hopeful or even more terrified of what was to come. Carlos turned to Lucas, who stood beside the microphone like a marble statue, his face pale and his hands visibly shaking. "Lucas," his father's voice echoed through the silent auditorium, "you have something to say to Miguel Hernandez, and to this entire school." Lucas looked at the audience of 600 faces, watching him expectantly, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed satisfaction at seeing the rich kid finally confronted. He searched the crowd for Miguel, and when their eyes met for the first time in weeks, Lucas saw not anger or fear, but a quiet dignity that made him feel even smaller. Lucas began, his voice cracking through the microphone. He cleared his throat and tried again, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. Carlos leaned closer and whispered something in his son's ear, something that made Lucas straighten his shoulders and take a deep breath. "Miguel Hernandez," he finally said, his voice stronger now, "I want to publicly apologize for what I did to you. I bullied you, stole your lunch money, destroyed your science project, and posted a humiliating video of you on social media." The auditorium was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, remembering how they had laughed at the video or made cruel comments. Lucas continued, each word seeming to be ripped from his soul. "I did it because I thought having money gave me the right to treat you as inferior. I was wrong, completely wrong. You didn't deserve anything I did, and I have no excuse for my behavior." Tears began to form in the eyes of some students, including Mrs. Patterson, who had never seen such a public and vulnerable apology. Miguel felt hot tears streaming down his face, but this time they weren't tears of humiliation. They were tears of relief, of validation, of finally having his pain publicly acknowledged. Lucas looked directly at him and said, "Miguel, I know my words can't undo the pain I've caused, but I want you to know that I will spend the next few months trying to become a better person, a person my father can be proud of." The auditorium remained in absolute silence for several seconds after Lucas finished, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a sacred promise everyone had witnessed. Carlos stepped up to the microphone, placing his hand on Lucas's shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and firm. He looked out at the audience of young faces, many still processing what they had just witnessed, and took a deep breath before speaking. "Students of Lincoln High, I stand here today not only as Lucas's father, but as someone who was once just like Miguel Hernandez." A murmur of surprise ran through the auditorium. It was hard to imagine the billionaire businessman as a poor kid. I grew up on the south side of Detroit, the son of a factory worker and a seamstress. I wore hand-me-down clothes, worked after school, and dreamed of a better future. I built my company from scratch because I believe that every person, regardless of where they were born or how much money they have, deserves respect and opportunity, Carlos continued, his voice gaining strength and passion. But somewhere along the way, I failed to teach my son these values. I gave him everything money could buy, but I forgot to give him the only thing that truly matters: character. Some teachers nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his words, while many students shifted uncomfortably, reflecting on their own behaviors and attitudes. Carlos looked directly at Miguel, who was still wiping tears from his face. "Miguel, I've researched you and your family. Your mother works 3 jobs to support you both. You have the best grades in your class, and you still find time to help other struggling students. At 15, you already demonstrate more character and integrity than many adults I know in the business world." The entire auditorium turned to look at Miguel, who bowed his head, clearly moved by the public recognition. "You are exactly the kind of young man our society needs, and I apologize for my son trying to break your spirit. I want you all to understand one thing," Carlos said, his voice echoing with moral authority throughout the auditorium. "True wealth is not in what you possess, but in what you do with the power you have. You may have money, influence, popularity, but if you use these things to hurt others, you are poor in spirit. Miguel Hernandez is richer in character than my son ever was, and that is why Lucas will spend the next few months learning what true wealth means through community service and service to others." The silence that followed was broken by a slow applause that began with Mrs. Patterson and gradually spread throughout the auditorium, until 600 students were applauding not only Carlos's words, but a father's courage in doing what was right. Carlos waited for the applause to die down before continuing, knowing the most important part of his speech was yet to come. He looked at Lucas, who stood beside him with his head bowed, clearly processing the magnitude of what had just happened. "But words alone are not enough," Carlos said, his voice cutting through the expectant silence of the auditorium. "Actions have consequences, and it's time for my son to learn that the hard way. Lucas will spend the next 6 months volunteering in the community, helping families facing the same hardships he mocked and belittled." A murmur of surprise ran through the audience. Some students whispered to each other, impressed by the severity of the punishment, while others nodded in approval. Carlos continued, "He'll work at a homeless shelter, help out at a soup kitchen, and tutor underprivileged children for free, not because he's legally obligated to, but because he needs to understand that privilege comes with responsibility." Lucas lifted his head for the first time, looking at his father with a mixture of shock and something that might have been respect. He had never seen Carlos make such a firm decision about his moral education. "Furthermore," Carlos announced, "I will establish a $100,000 annual scholarship fund specifically for students like Miguel, young people who demonstrate academic excellence despite financial hardship." The auditorium erupted in applause, and Miguel felt as if the ground had dropped out from under him. He looked around, seeing classmates who had previously avoided him now smiling and applauding, some even nodding at him with approval and respect. Mrs. Patterson was openly weeping, finally seeing justice served in a way she could never have imagined. Carlos turned to the audience one last time. "I want you to take away a lesson from this experience. No matter who you are or where you come from, you have the power to choose what kind of person you want to be. You can choose to use your strength to hurt those weaker than you, or you can choose to use your strength to lift others up." Miguel Hernandez chose to maintain his dignity even when he was unfairly attacked. "My son chose to be a bully. Today, he is learning that it's never too late to choose to be better." The silence that followed was deep and reflective, as if each person in the audience was examining their own choices and behaviors. After the assembly, Carlos asked to speak with Miguel privately in the principal's office. The boy entered hesitantly, still processing everything that had happened in the last 30 minutes. His life had changed completely, from a school outcast to someone publicly championed by the most powerful man in Chicago. Carlos stood as Miguel entered, extending his hand in a gesture of equal respect. "Miguel, thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I know my son has caused you a lot of pain, and I want you to know that this stops today." Miguel shook Carlos's hand, still a little intimidated by the businessman's presence, but touched by the sincerity in his eyes. "Mr. Morrison, I don't know what to say. I never thought anyone would—" His voice trailed off, too emotional to continue. Carlos placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You don't need to say anything, Miguel. You've already said it all through the way you handled this situation. Your dignity, your strength, your refusal to stoop to my son's level, that says more about your character than 1,000 words could." Carlos sat down, motioning for Miguel to do the same. "I've researched you and your family. Your mother is an extraordinary woman, and you are an exceptional young man. I want to help you, not out of pity, but because I believe that investing in people like you is investing in the future of our society." He pulled a business card from his pocket. "This is the number for my personal assistant. If you or your mother need anything, help with medical bills, school supplies, anything, I want you to call. And when you graduate from high school, there's a guaranteed spot for you at the university of your choice. All expenses paid." Miguel stared at the card in his hands, tears streaming silently down his face. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Carlos smiled, a genuine warm smile. "Because when I was your age, no one did this for me. I had to fight alone for every opportunity. But you don't have to fight alone, Miguel. You have talent, character, and determination. All you need now are opportunities, and I will make sure you get them." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, two completely different worlds united by the mutual understanding that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in dignity and compassion. In the weeks following the historic assembly, Lincoln High School underwent a transformation no one could have predicted. Miguel's humiliating video was removed from social media, but not because of pressure or threats. Students themselves began reporting it en masse, ashamed of their participation in the cruelty. Groups of students approached Miguel to apologize for laughing at or sharing the video, some admitting they only did so out of fear of becoming Lucas's next target. Carlos Morrison's courage in publicly confronting his own son had inspired others to examine their own behavior. Ms. Patterson noticed immediate changes in her classes. Students who had previously bullied quieter classmates now included them in discussions and group projects. The popular versus nerdy culture that had dominated the school for years began to dissolve, replaced by a mutual respect she had never seen in 15 years of teaching. During a lesson on To Kill a Mockingbird, a student commented, "It's like Mr. Morrison said, having power doesn't give you the right to hurt others." The discussion that followed was the most profound and thoughtful she had ever led. Miguel himself became a respected figure at school, not out of pity, but out of genuine admiration. Students who had previously avoided him now sought his help with math and science, impressed not only by his intelligence, but by his willingness to help even those who had been cruel to him. He organized voluntary study groups, mediated conflicts between peers, and became a voice of reason and compassion that other students naturally followed. His once empty cafeteria table was now always surrounded by genuine friends. The school administration also changed its approach. Principal Foster implemented a more rigorous anti-bullying program, inspired by Carlos's courage. Teachers received training on how to identify and intervene in bullying situations, and an anonymous reporting system was established. But the most significant change didn't come from policies or rules. It came from the transformation of the hearts and minds of students who had witnessed firsthand the power of accountability, forgiveness, and redemption. Lincoln High became an example for other schools in the region, proving that a single courageous action can change an entire culture. 3 weeks after the assembly, something unexpected happened during lunch. Lucas approached the table where Miguel was sitting with his new friends, carrying his tray with visibly nervous hands. The cafeteria fell silent. Everyone remembered the last time Lucas had approached Miguel, and the tension was palpable. "Miguel," Lucas said quietly, Can I sit here?" The question sounded genuine, vulnerable, completely different from the arrogance that usually characterized their interactions. Miguel looked at his friends, who nodded encouragingly and indicated an empty chair. "Sure." The first few minutes were uncomfortable, with Lucas eating in silence while the others chatted cautiously around him. But gradually, he began to participate in the discussions, first with shy comments about classes, then genuinely sharing his opinions on school projects. Miguel noticed that Lucas seemed different, more humble, more attentive to others, as if he were truly listening instead of just waiting his turn to speak. When one of Miguel's friends mentioned difficulties with chemistry, Lucas offered help without arrogance, simply saying, "I have a private tutor. I can ask him to explain that topic to all of us. Over the next few weeks, an unlikely friendship began to blossom. Lucas discovered that Miguel was incredibly intelligent and funny when he felt comfortable, while Miguel saw that behind the facade of wealth, Lucas was simply an insecure kid who had never learned to genuinely connect with others. They began studying together at the library, Lucas helping Miguel with resources his family couldn't afford, while Miguel helped Lucas understand concepts no expensive tutor had been able to explain clearly. The irony was not lost on him. The poor kid was teaching the rich kid about the things that truly mattered. The turning point came when Lucas defended Miguel from some students from another school during a basketball game. They had made cruel comments about Miguel's modest clothing, and Lucas immediately sided with his friend. "He's worth more than all of you combined," Lucas said with a conviction that surprised even himself. After the game, as they walked home, Miguel smiled at Lucas. "Thank you for defending me." Lucas shook his head. "Thank you for giving me a second chance. I didn't deserve it, but you gave it to me anyway." In that moment, they both understood they had found something rare, a friendship based on mutual growth, forgiveness, and genuine respect. 6 months after the assembly that changed everything, Carlos and Lucas sat in their home office, reviewing the reports of the community service work the boy had completed. Lucas had served meals in shelters, taught math to underprivileged children, and helped families organize their finances, experiences that had transformed him profoundly and irreversibly. "Dad," Lucas said, closing the last report, "I want to keep doing this work, even after my punishment is over." Carlos smiled, recognizing in his son a maturity that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. "Why?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. "Because I finally understood what you always tried to teach me," Lucas replied, looking directly into his father's eyes. "Money is just a tool. What matters is how you use that tool. I can use our wealth to feel superior to others, or I can use it to make a difference in people's lives." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Miguel taught me that dignity is priceless. He had less than me in material terms, but he was richer in everything that truly matters. I want to be like him." Carlos stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "You know, Lucas, I built this company thinking I was leaving you a legacy. Buildings, bank accounts, investments. I thought those were inheritances." He turned to his son. "But now I realize that the true legacy isn't what I leave you, but what you do with what you've been given. And for the first time, I'm proud of the man you're becoming." The words touched Lucas deeply, and he felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Miguel will graduate as valedictorian next month," Lucas said, changing the subject to hide his emotion. "He asked me to help write his speech. He said he wants to talk about second chances and how people can change." Carlos nodded, struck by the poetic irony of the situation. "And you? What have you learned about second chances?" Lucas thought for a moment before answering. "I've learned that they're not given, they're earned, and that the hardest person to forgive sometimes is yourself. But when you can do that, when you can truly change, you discover that life has much more meaning than you imagined." Father and son sat in comfortable silence, both knowing that this conversation marked not just the end of a lesson, but the beginning of a new way of living, a life where true richness was measured in compassion, growth, and the courage to always strive to be better. This story shows us that it's never too late to change, never too late to do what's right. Carlos Morrison could have used his money and influence to hush up the problem, shield his son from the consequences, and continue perpetuating a cycle of privilege without accountability. But he chose the harder path, the path of true fatherhood, moral courage, and genuine transformation. What about you? When was the last time you had the courage to do what was right, even when it was difficult? How many times have you seen injustice happening around you and chosen silence out of convenience? How many opportunities to be a Carlos Morrison have you passed up? The truth is, we all have power, maybe not billions of dollars, but we do have influence in our families, our jobs, our communities. The question isn't whether you have power, but how you choose to use it. Miguel teaches us that dignity can't be bought or stolen. It comes from within, from how you choose to respond to life's adversities. Lucas shows us that real change is possible when you have the courage to face your flaws and work to be better. And Carlos proves to us that being a father, a leader, a human being, sometimes means making decisions that hurt in the moment, but heal forever. If this story touched your heart, if it made you reflect on your own choices and relationships, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because stories like this, stories that challenge us to be better, that remind us of the power of redemption and the importance of standing up for what's right, are exactly what our world needs to hear more often.